As with the last speech, I've got my flow of the speech, I've got some global commentary on the speech, my evaluation of the speech, and some attempts at revising his talk outline. So let's go ahead and begin with just walking through the talk. So, in general, I do like this speech. I think it's enjoyable. I think he's a delightful speaker. That said, it's not ideal, and there's still some areas to revise. So let's start off here. So the opening, he actually goes ahead and says what his goals are. This is a good speech in that sense for talking about what speech goals are. And you don't always have to say what your speech goals are, but you can if you wish. And in some ways, that can help clarify for the audience the nature of the talk. So a lot of his decisions in this talk make sense given that he states as his goal to change the way we think about honeybees. And so if that's the goal, a lot of his decisions, particularly those in the last portion of the speech where he moves through those images, make a little bit more sense, and they kind of have a logic to them. So he opens up, he talks about the goals. He's got a really good section in this, and we'll return to this in our discussion of introductions for informative speeches, about talking why bees are important, why you should care about this topic. Even if you haven't thought necessarily that honeybees have an impact on your life, he's got an argument here basically saying bees are important to agriculture and bees are important to financing. Then he talks a little bit about urban agriculture. He's got some pictures there, and he says, as it currently stands, we hide our bees. Then he jumps over to this point about how pollination works. Then he jumps back to a point about urban living in the future will need bees. So my first issue with this is structurally. He's got this thing that he says about urban agriculture, then he stops it midway through because he ends up talking more about urban agriculture later on with this point about pollination. So he's kind of breaking apart his opening discussion of urban agriculture to drop in this section about pollination. I would agree that this point on pollination is probably quite important. People may have forgotten their fifth grade nature class, but he's breaking apart something that probably needs to be retained as a whole. Anyway, so he's got the pollination, which is very clear discussion, informative speaking on how pollination occurs, some urban living in the future, and then he's got this point on interesting results on urban beekeeping. So bees like cities, die-offs may not occur as much as on cities, and just some rumination on why cities might be good for bees. That's that section he has about urban islands. Then he sort of talks about, well, there's this larger crisis with regards to honeybees, the Varroa mite. Then he talks about his research, his background, and he talks about what he researches. He says, I research what makes bees healthier. He's got a nice contrastive point here. He says, here's what other people study in terms of understanding what makes them ill, but I don't do that. I look at what makes them healthier. And then he's got some good discussion, some funny discussion about working on immune boosters for bees. And then he's got this very large point on images of urban beekeeping. He talks about sample hives at the Fairmont Hotel and Classroom Hives Project and beekeeping being illegal in New York City for a while, and then the red honey in Brooklyn and the Paris urban beekeeping and the London urban beekeeping. And that's all this images point. I'll come back to this section, but I actually really like this point. And I didn't think that I would. When I first saw it, but I think it's sort of an innovative way of just providing a pretty holistic understanding of a topic, and he does such a good discussion with discussing each one of those case studies in a way that makes sense for the larger issue of urban beekeeping. So we'll return to this, but I really do like that point, and I think it works well, especially given his goal was to change how we think about beekeeping. And then he's got a very general conclusion where he says, once again, I wanted to change your perspective about honeybees, and he suggests other things that you might do, like go get a hive or something. So if I'm sort of organizing my comments in terms of invention, arrangement, style, and delivery, under invention, boy, there's some really great information in there, and he didn't leave much out, but this could probably have been edited a little bit better. There's probably some stuff that could be cut and or consolidated. So in terms of invention, there wasn't necessarily a lack, but there were a couple of points where he ended up having too much of a digression, I think. That speaks a bit to arrangement. The main thing I had on this speech, my main concern with this speech, as with the other one, was sort of an arrangement issue. This really did feel like it jumped around a great deal, and I didn't really get a strong sense of what the organizing logic was, what the flow of the speech was. Like I said, he takes this point on urban agriculture, jumps over to pollination, then jumps back over to urban agriculture. So you're kind of breaking a point what would probably be a coherent claim on its own. But I'll go ahead and mention this here. So I do like that snapshots of urban beekeeping because when he gets into each one of those examples, he gives us the narrow example, but then he starts breaking it out in terms of how this impacts urban beekeeping as a whole. So the red honey point I thought was particularly good because he just has this picture of in Brooklyn, some guy has red honey. But then he gets to say, oh, well, it's a very specific form of local honey production. And so they had gotten the pollen from this factory for cherries. And so that is what made this honey particularly, had made it that color. And then he sort of slides in this point about what's really neat about that is you can create honey really based on that tastes like the flowers of your area. Well, that's a really neat point. And it's a point that he wouldn't have wanted to make he would not have wanted to move into that idea from top down, right? So a main point wouldn't be you get to make honey that tastes like your local area. But that wouldn't make sense as a full standalone point. But because he's discussing it through this example, because he's discussing it more inductively, he gets into the specific details and then just makes this really interesting point. And I think he does it a lot in that snapshots point. So once again, I think that was an innovative response to the constraints of his topic and this audience. He came up with a way of giving us both breadth and depth in that final point through those pictures and through those snapshots. In terms of style, very engaging, a good sense of humor. We'll also speak a bit to this, but he doesn't necessarily have jokes. He just has to be funny. That's a nice thing in many cases, about public speaking and how public speaking is different from doing stand-up comedy. Stand-up comedy, you've got to write jokes, and if those jokes don't land, you are failed. But in something like this, in this type of presentation, he just gets to be funny. He just gets to make sort of slight asides, and the audience eats it up. In many cases, the nice thing about public speaking, this is my anecdotal evidence, in many cases, the nice thing about public speaking is the threshold for humor is so stupid low you could trip on it. And so all you have to do in many cases is be funny, or at least indicate a willingness to your audience that you're trying to be funny. And I think he sort of succeeds very admirably in that regard. In terms of delivery, I certainly think he could slow down. He's going pretty fast. And then the other thing I really hear in this presentation is he needs to breathe. I can always tell when there's some issues with breathing because I feel myself getting short of breath listening to a talk like this. He's not, if you'll remember back to the impromptu speech, so back in week 3, remember the guy who had sort of the panic attack at the city council meeting? That's not what's happening here, but in some ways, many of the mechanisms are the same. He's not taking in a full breath of air, and he's not pushing all the air out when he speaks. So I do think he could probably breathe a little bit more and thus slow down. So in terms of the evaluation form, invention, that's a strong good. I think his key ideas could use some editing, but there's a lot of information there. In terms of his evidence and explanation, that's a good, possibly a slight, I don't feel like I could totally throw that over to excellent, but it's a very strong good. He does so much with his examples and with his evidence. Maybe I'll put that in excellent. The more I talk about it, the more I think about it. He was using evidence and examples as a way of informing, and they just really synthesized the content for me. In terms of arrangement, there's so much editing I want to do here, so probably an adequate there. But it's interesting to see. He can have excellent invention and still need to do some work on arrangement. So these don't always, one doesn't promise the other. In terms of style, good or excellent. He certainly demonstrated a sense of enthusiasm and excitement about this topic, and it's infectious. I mean, he's an engaging speaker. Could probably slow down, but I certainly think he conveys that sense of ethos. Memory and delivery, I need some more breathing. Maybe there's some overexcitement there. I can empathize with that. But yeah, that's probably at least a strong good.